Yep. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Richard Parker. I teach here at the Kennedy School and am the biographer of a famous Harvard economist, John Kenneth Galbraith. Galbraith, among his 48 books, wrote one of the most instructive histories of the Great Crash imaginable, entitled simply The Great Crash, 1929. And for those of you who would like insight into the current situation, although not precisely analogous, I commend to you Professor Galbraith's book, The Great Crash. This evening, we're going to try to engage not simply the question of the terms of the bailout of the national and international financial system that is underway as we speak, but rather to try to look ahead to the question of re-regulation of the financial system, both domestically and internationally. It seems broadly to be the consensus of the moment that some re-regulation is necessary, but what kind and what extent and who the regulators will be and whether they will be from the private sector or the public sector and what coordination will occur among regulators both nationally and across borders all remain to be debated. And it's our hope that this is a conversation that begins to include not just the specialists but the public, that brings to the main street of both America and the world an opportunity to participate in that debate. With me tonight are three extraordinarily talented individuals to discuss this. To my immediate left is Jack Blum, a senior attorney at Baker Hostetler in Washington, and more importantly, for years, a senior investigator for Senate committees, who, among other things, was responsible for breaking the BCCI scandal, for many of you who can remember it, the Lockheed overseas payment scandal, ITT's involvement in the Nixon administration in Chile and its overthrow. He's currently specializes as an attorney in financial market white-collar crime, and I think brings a dimension to the discussion of market reform that hasn't, in general, been on the table yet. To his immediate left is Dr. Robert Duggar, who is managing director of Tudor Investment, one of the world's largest private investment firms. He was before that policy director of the American Bankers Association and served as senior economist for both the House and Senate banking committees. He brings both a wealth of experience in the private sector and in public regulation and public monitoring of the financial world. We're delighted to have him with us. And finally, Joe Stiglitz. I don't think Joseph Stiglitz needs any introduction, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, author of an extraordinary array of books, both technical and popular, and was former chairman of the President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors and chief economist of the World Bank. His experience in this panel tonight, I think, is going to be invaluable in addition to the other participants. So let's get right to work. Joe, what I'd like to do is start by referencing the G20 meeting that occurred this past weekend, which was an attempt, at least, to begin the discussion internationally of what the terms of market re-regulation might look like. What really happened? What do you think should be happening? What should be on the table in discussions like these?
Well, first let me say that it was a very important thing that it was the G20, not the G7. And that was important in part because the G7 are bankrupt. And all the money is in Asia, the Middle East. And I say that because it's important in thinking about restructuring the global financial system to realize there's been a very big change in the structure as in the last 40 years, but our global institutions have not responded. And the United States is still has the veto power at the IMF. And so you have this irony of some of the leaders of the G7 going around begging other countries to give them money, but to say, don't worry, we'll spend it well, having misspent it so badly, he says, trust us. So what again was remarkable in many ways is how ingrained they are in how they really believe the current system works, just tinker it a little bit. And that's really the point I want to make. What they said is, we understand markets aren't perfect, and then they look at what is the imperfection that they identified, and that is lack of transparency. Now, lack of transparency is very important. You can't have markets that work if there's not good information. But the problem is not lack of transparency alone, but problems of incentives. They had incentives to be myopic, short-sighted, excessive risk-taking, bad accounting, the incentives of the stock options, have incentives to get your stock price up, and that means to put everything off the balance sheet. We saw that in the WorldCom and Enron scandals at the beginning of the decade, and this is just a continuation. We didn't do anything about that in Sarbanes-Oxley and the reforms that we had at the beginning of the decade. So we need reforms in the incentives. We need reforms in the kind of products that are put out there. One of the reasons that we need those reforms is that one of the things that happened was quite clearly predatory lending. They took advantage of poorer people. You know, there's an idea that's been going around lately that there's a lot of money at the bottom of the pyramid. Wall Street recognized it and decided it ought to go to the top. And they tried to do it as fast as they could. And part of the irony is that they were burned in the process, because while they thought they were just getting their money, in fact, they wound up losing shareholder money. And that goes to the corporate governance issue. The shareholders lost the money, but the CEOs wound up with a lot of secured money. So we need to have regulations about the kinds of products that are bought, held, sold by particularly the core financial system, commercial banks, fiduciaries. We recognize that in the late 90s, actually even when I was in the Council of Economic Advisors, we had discussions about the derivatives. We hadn't used the evocative language that Warren Buffett, where he called them financial weapons of mass destruction. Right. But it was clear that they were very dangerous. But the response of Greenspan, our Secretary of Treasury, basically all the deregulators was, yes, they're dangerous, but to regulate was more dangerous. They said it would stifle innovation. And this is one really important point. Yes, they innovated. The innovations were regulatory arbitrage to get around the regulations, accounting arbitrage to get around the accounting frameworks that would give good information, tax arbitrage, a lot of tax stuff, which I'm sure you can talk about. That was the innovation, but they didn't innovate in ways to make our economy more efficient. In fact, it was lowering efficiency. You can see that in a couple ways. One of them is to remember that the financial sector is a means to an end. In fact, I'm chairman of a commission that President Sarkozy appointed to look at the question of the measurement of economic performance. And one issue is, should you even include the financial services as final output? It's an intermediary. Right. And yet, this sector, which is supposed to help other sectors, was garnering for itself about 1/3 of all corporate profits in the United States and similarly in the UK. That should be a mark of inefficiency, not of efficiency. And they were supposed to be managing risk, but what they did is created risk, and they didn't create the products that allowed, for instance, Americans to stay in their homes when interest rates fluctuated. And so now already 3.6 million Americans have lost their home. We expect another 2 million to lose it in the next 12 months or so. So it's clear that while they were getting a lot of returns for themselves, there was no congruence between private rewards and social returns. The innovations were not innovations that helped our economy. And so that suggests that a wide ambit for regulation, none of that recognized in the, at least recognized very fully in that G20, a little bit of language. But really, what's, at least one of the battles is going to be, do we have minimal regulation, cosmetic regulation, to allow them to continue operating as before. As soon as, the hope was, the hope is that economy recover and everybody forget. We had exactly that same problem back in 1997, 98, in the global East Asian global financial crisis. Some of the same people who are active in the debate today said, oh, we need a reform of the global financial architecture. Let's begin a discussion. And it was very clear. They didn't intend any reform. They wanted to talk long enough that the economy would recover and nothing would be done. And some of the same people who were talking about transparency then, I guess I have to tell this one story, and then which was the Deputy Secretary of Treasury at the time, after talking about the importance of transparency in East Asia, that was one of the main, viewed as one of the main causes of the problem. The developing countries came back and said, well, what about transparency of hedge funds? And his response is, that's not what we meant to talk about. We meant transparency for you, not for us. And then he came out with an argument, which was, if you have too much information, you won't have incentives to gather information. So he actually, having beaten the developing countries for a lack of transparency, actually came forward with an argument for why transparency was a bad thing. Now, you could understand this was not well received by the developing countries.
Rob, let me have you continue on. You straddle both Wall Street and Washington and know this very well from both sides. What is Wall Street's cooperation going to be in the coming months in the process of re-regulation? What do you think they're looking for in terms of regulation, or what do they expect? They were the largest sectoral contributor to the Obama campaign, and they must have some expectation for return on their investment. What do you think it is?
I think that Joe, as he often does, given his capacity to just look deep into a subject, and your question to start with the G20 is the right way to talk, and it actually provides an answer for your question about aspects of Wall Street. I think Wall Street's a very big place, and there are many different participants, and some are just looking for a job. Others are
more will be soon. Yes.
Yes, there are 52,000. In 1929, the debt to GDP ratio got to 250% of GDP. And that was pretty high, extraordinary, and it resulted in the crash of historic scale. But those guys were pikers. They didn't have the financial advantages, technology we have. In the summer of 2007, we got our debt to GDP ratio up to 350% of GDP. 29, 250%, 2007, 350%. We're in a massive deleveraging process now. And this process will, as Joe suggests, will continue deeply for a long time. An important question about supervision and regulation is creating a framework of governance, both in the public sector and the private sector, that leans against that process. That whether through processes of transparency or changed incentives, it does not create what George Soros calls a reflexive process, which self-amplifies up to extreme heights, and upon becoming exhausted, takes the entire society with it. Now, an answer to your question about what Wall Street wants, the part of Wall Street that I am a part of, I'm one of many managing directors of a large hedge fund, asset management company, more politely described. But what we're looking for is a framework in which supervision and regulation addresses core principles. It addresses principles to establish stability, and mechanically, in dealing with stability, it is addressing the too big to fail problem. That is, that there's no company which is truly too big for us to take apart step by step if necessary for the greater good. Another thing we're looking for is a process that halts the accumulation or amplification of existing imbalances. Without a doubt, George Bush's decision to tell Sarkozy that it would not be a G7 meeting, it would be a G20 meeting, in my judgment, that was the best decision of his entire presidency. I guess you can detect my political leanings, but let me. It was the best decision of his presidency, and I believe it takes the very first extremely important step in the re-regulation or supervision process. Getting to 350% of GDP meant that we were selling assets to the rest of the world in order to bring their savings to the United States to finance our consumption. We have been unsustainably operating on a consumption-led growth, debt finance strategy for arguably 3 or 4 decades. In order to continue that process, you've got to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the society to pull up assets to package up and sell to somebody else. The crowning achievement of American finance of the last 10 years has been the extraordinary cleverness with which we wrapped this stuff we were pulling from the bottom of our economy, this sausage.
The 0% down, adjustable
0% down, 0% down, adjustable rate, prime rate, option arms, all of this stuff that Joe rightfully says may be a violation of consumer laws.
Right.
But we pull all this stuff up, we wrap it with AAA ratings, we dress it up with credit default swap insurance, credit default insurance, put it in securitized packages, and then repackage that as collateralized debt obligations, and I don't want to go into a long discussion about that. But we dress it up so it's like filet mignon, and we sell it all over the world.
That was the great thing about globalization.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We had a world of fools that we could try to market.
We
weren't limited.
And we were so talented. What we did, we sold it it's an interesting thing to look at the chart of sale of private assets abroad from roughly 1997 to 2007. The chart just goes like this, right up till it gets to $590 billion annualized rate in the summer of 2007. And then at that point, the markets around the world began to hear about these subprime issues. So they opened up their filet mignon. And they discovered, oh, it's not. It's just sausage. And it has a few subprime mouse hairs on it. And we don't think we want anymore. And instantly, the sales of private assets abroad collapsed from $590 billion annualized rate down hundreds of billions of dollars in the space of 90 days. That was the start of the credit contraction. That was the point at which the American economy, inhaling the oxygen from the rest of the world, was cut off, and the private sector immediately seized up, and immediately the government had to begin to act like a bank itself, issuing debt, bringing the money in, handing it out as first a $150 billion stimulus package, and then a TARP, and various variety of Federal Reserve liquidity provision measures, and we've been gasping for breath since then. A core, get to your, let me just conclude this, and before we get to full discussion of this, the truly dark side of the subject. We need a framework which recognizes that we're an integrated global economy.
Yes.
We need a framework, a supervisory framework, which recognizes that this is one economy and that we must have something that prevents the steady amplification of unfinanceable or unsustainable imbalances.
Can I come back a little bit?
Just briefly, and then I want to get Jack in.
To the questioning you originally posed, what is Wall Street? There are many different people on Wall Street, and there are a few responsible people. and George Soros has been writing about the fact that there are these global imbalances that we push, for instance, counter-cyclical policies in the United States. We follow counter-cyclical policies that dampen fluctuations in the United States and Western Europe. But in the developing countries, the IMF, the US Treasury, forces them to have pro-cyclical policies. When they go into a downturn, they raise interest rates, they cut back expenditures, they do exactly the opposite. Well, it sounds like hypocrisy, but it's actually worse than that. Because what that means is it increases the volatility in the developing countries. It makes it less attractive to keep money in the developing countries. And it makes it easier when we have trouble right now. The big irony is U.S. is the source of the problem, and yet capital is flowing to the United States because they know that Wall Street knows that there's going to be a lot of fluctuations in the developing countries, and we'll be able to manage our way through it because of our wealth. And we're using their capital to help us manage our way through it. But so there are a few people who understand this on Wall Street and think that they can do better in a more stable environment. But I think most of them are hoping for cosmetic reforms that can say, we solved the problem, but let's not change our basic business model.
Thank you. Jack,
well,
I can feel it, right? You're the lawyer here at the table, and economists tend to think in terms of markets. Lawyers tend to think in terms of corporations. And I think that lawyers also tend to think in terms of regulation and law and failure of regulation and law. Yeah. And you have a few things to say about that.
More than a few. Let's start with a very simple proposition. Banking has a social function, and that is to invest the ready money of the society in a relatively safe way, particularly commercial banking, which has the responsibility of ensuring loans will be repaid. Now, when I started out in my career, if you wanted a loan, you went into a bank and they asked you all kinds of nasty questions. Do you have a job? Are you likely to be able to repay the loan? What other debts do you have? What does your cash flow look like? Well, there's a problem with that kind of banking. And the problem is it's not very profitable, because half the time you have to say no to your customer. And there are absolute limits on how much you can charge for making that kind of loan. It just isn't profitable. So what the banks began to do, business consultants piled in the 70s and 80s and 90s to say, look, this model stinks. What you have to do is outsource the business of underwriting loans to people who aren't regulated. Mortgage companies, finance companies, anybody but a bank that has a regulator who's looking at, well, did you ask these nasty questions? So they did. And then they discovered that the other thing you don't do is keep that paper on your books. What you do is lend money to the guy you outsource the underwriting to, and then you sell the end product to some other guy who has no idea what they're buying, and in the process collect massive fees. You don't care whether that money will be repaid. And there is the essential failing of the American banking system. And that the regulators permitted banks to go off the rails that way is both shocking and astonishing. And you can trace, one by one, major banks that were absolutely conservative, bedrock, did it all right, who suddenly were taken over hostilely because their earnings weren't increasing geometrically. Now, there's something else you have to understand. There's no such thing as perpetual increases in earnings without incredible risk. It's a fundamental law of economics. And there are people who are floating around talking about, we will increase our earnings 15%, 20% annually. And if you were running a hedge fund, what, 40, 50? Now, part of the way you do that is to move all of this stuff you're peddling and all of the money you're taking in outside of the reach of the tax collector, outside of the reach of the accountant, and basically outside of the reach of any regulator. So all of this junk got moved offshore. And what I call it is money on steroids. Tax subsidized because nobody's taxing it, and cited in places like the Cayman Islands, the Isle of Man, Jersey, Liechtenstein. And to give you a feel for the kinds of things that have gone on, you probably have read this, UBS, one of the world's largest banks, bailed out recently by our Federal Reserve, mind you, which provided the dollars to the Swiss Central Bank to bail them out, was soliciting rich Americans to keep their money in undisclosed accounts in Switzerland. The amount of money they had in those 20,000 accounts was $20 billion, and the amount of money they were taking in fees annually off it, $200 million. And then what were they investing it in? The garbage that was coming out of subprime here in the US, produced by their bank and others. All of this is outside of the scope of regulation, outside of the scope of tax collection, and completely off the books. Now, we have a regulatory system. It's a hell of a system. But the problem is that the regulators were looking at the US books of the US institutions. And those books didn't show the garbage. Amazingly, a bank like Citibank could have a sieve in the Cayman Islands after Enron. Enron hid off the books tens of millions of dollars of debt, maybe even billions of dollars of debt, billions of dollars of debt, in special purpose vehicles offshore, and they were listed as contingent liabilities, and those guys go to jail. Here comes Citibank. They have sieves. They've moved garbage into the sieves, kept it off the books, make it look like a contingent liability, and lo and behold, they get bailed out. Good morning. What's going on here? I have a real problem with this approach to the discussion of regulation. You cannot have a global, seamless financial system, which we now have, when you have banks that are governed and regulated nationally, but doing business globally. You can't have 90 countries in the business of providing regulatory arbitrage who say, come to us because we have no rules at all. I was in London 2 weeks ago and met a guy whose job it is to assess the accountability and fiduciary capacity of boards of directors under the rules of different countries. And he described a visit to the Isle of Man. Now, his organization says you can't provide decent fiduciary responsibility if you're on the board of more than 200 corporations. So he's on the Isle of Man, and he says, I'm in a room with a group of guys who are on the boards of directors of corporations in the Isle of Man. And I ask, how many of you are on 200 or more boards? Every hand in the room goes up. He says 500 or more boards. Every hand in the room goes up. 1,000 or more. Every hand in the room goes up. What are those corporations doing? They are shells for money that is right here in the United States, which goes on all of these international economic numbers as foreign investment. You know, when you get things like the largest foreign investor in Colombia is Anguilla. Good morning. Who's kidding who? You get Mauritius as the largest investor in India. You get insanity is what you get. No tax collected, no rules, nobody knows what's going on, and the only way to do it is put all those places out of business. Now, we got close to some of that, and it may begin to happen when these guys leave town, these guys being Bush and the current economic team. There was an incident. A gentleman removed the records of the LGT Bank in Liechtenstein and gave it to the German government. The head of Deutsche Post was arrested. Hundreds of Germans are being packed off to the pokey because they didn't pay maybe about $900 million to $1 billion in tax. Germany is angry. The Germans have talked to the French. They too have a list of LGT customers. So do 13 other countries. And they're all beginning to say, wait a minute, what's happened here is the richest people in the world have opted out of national economies and national economic rules. Now that has a central fact to pay attention to, is related to a central fact, and the central fact is wealth distribution. Because a dirty secret of this whole mess is that over the last 10 years, we've watched wealth move right up to the top, and all these people who are supposedly getting the wondrous benefits of these loans are getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And the people who are taking the money are preaching, no union organization, we're giving them too much. If we're going to bail out GM, get rid of the benefits, the worker benefits, the health benefits, the retirement benefits. To what end? Now, I put to you that the rescue here begins at the bottom and works its way up. I put to you that the regulation has to be something that does not permit regulatory arbitrage with the Isle of Man and the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. It has to also include a guarantee that taxes are collected, and you, who are going to be withheld, get equal treatment with the people who've managed to set up an offshore shell and have investments in hedge funds that may or may not be ever reported to the tax collector.
Rob.
I want to amplify what you've just said, but in a slightly different set of words. What you've described is a circumstance, and maybe it's a way of looking at an economy. I'm not sure, but my personal perception is that when we see a financial sector collapsing, we're really seeing an economy collapsing. The financial sector is just the dressing around the economy. And the economy is organized around a political philosophy. And when we see an economy collapsing, we're really seeing also a way of thinking that is collapsing. And so in some respects, we may be witnessing the exhaustion of a political philosophy which did not put every citizen first. It did not look out for the rights of every citizen, American and Indian or Chinese or any of them. It did not operate in transparency. It did not focus on the long term. It did not respect truth. It operated in secrecy and frequently used deception and misrepresentation as a marketing device. If this diagnosis is correct, it provides a basis for, as you say, it starts at the bottom by fixing these principles of social governance. And then an economy can be reorganized again. What you're describing to me, it seems, is that the key infrastructure, the thing that's holding everything together, is trust. And we have just seen the exhaustion of trust. What the G20 was about, in a sense, to get back to your, I thought, a very interesting way to start this discussion, is that to get the G20 back to where other citizens in other countries will trust us. It must be, Joe, that a sign of recovery of our economy is when foreigners trust us enough to begin to reinvest again.
Let me frame. I want to frame this. Do you think that American leadership under the incoming Obama administration and in Congress have the strength of vision to try to regenerate that trust? The sense that I got out of that G20 meeting was that the current administration is hell-bent to maintain an American exclusivity in international finance, the way national defense policy under Bush was dedicated to maintaining U.S. hegemony in military terms. That we've got a kind of military and financial markets uniqueness, king on the mountain, if you will, king on the hill philosophy that hasn't come to terms with what you've just described. Do you think that this new administration can do, the politics are there to do that?
Well, let me first make one observation. The fact is that if we give a guarantee and a developing country gives a guarantee, it doesn't mean the same thing. So money may come to us even though you might say, we're the source of the problem, even though we are doing all the things that you describe. I think one of the ways the debate is going to be framed is that if we start regulating, others won't, and the money will go away from us, and it will be this regulatory competition, this race to the bottom. I mean, that's the way it's going to be framed. And that's why it has to be a global a global discussion.
Much as we got to national banking regulation in the United States and away from state-based
Excuse me,
banking.
but that's kind of the fantasy. That's how we got to where we are. We've had the race to the bottom. Everybody moved to the Cayman Islands.
Well, see, that's what
That
he's
argument is over.
No, what he's saying is that we stop that.
Okay, but
by-
if we stop that, does it get any worse than the fact they've already moved?
No,
We're
no,
there.
no,
That's the
you're-
problem.
So one of the arguments is going to be you can't stop it. And what I want to argue is
Yes, you
not
can.
only you have
Yes,
to,
you
it's
can,
very
to borrow
easy.
from another
yes,
speaker.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Yes,
you can.
And it's
And I'm fired up. We're ready to go.
Repeat after
Ready
Dr.
to go.
Stiglitz, yes, you can.
Yes, you can.
And the question, it's not that difficult.
Right.
For instance,
Okay.
all we have to do is to tell our banks, you can't deal with these countries that don't sign on a global compact of what a good regulation is.
There's another issue underneath this, which is very important. All of this international gambling, all of this huge inflation in contracts which I can't understand why they're not covered by current law, like these guarantees that were issued by AIG, you know, the debt guarantees. Why isn't that an insurance policy to be regulated? And the answer is somebody slipped something into a regulation that could be interpreted by my colleagues at the bar as making it not an insurance policy, and everybody then said it wasn't. But all of this has been done in dollars. Now, one of the interesting aspects is all the banks around the world participated in the same game, the British being way ahead of our banks in terms of gambling. But then if you really want to see bad stuff, try Ireland, which funded all of the real gambling by the hedge funds. Look at what happened in Iceland. Now, there's an interesting problem. All of these banks got indebted in dollars. There's only one institution in the world that can print dollars, and that's the Federal Reserve. So, of necessity, all of these people come begging at our door. And of necessity, we are the ones who are at the center of the bailouts. So when UBS needs $20 billion to cover gambling in dollars, which exceeded the GDP of Switzerland by 4 times, the Swiss central bank looks at them and says, look, we don't have the dollars. If we sell Swiss francs to buy that many dollars, it'll be worth a used Kleenex on a platform of the New York City subway. So please, oh Fed, swap the dollars with Swiss francs and bail out our bank. So are we going to be at the center of this? Of course we are. Now, it is now also our obligation to be at the center of the fix. And the fix here is to tell the Brits and to tell our institutions, if we don't have an agreement with you that says everything that happens in your space is as transparent as we'd like it to be, we don't do business with you, period, full stop. And we don't recognize your corporations. Why should an Isle of Man corporation be allowed to open an American bank account? 1,000 directorships for a single guy? You know, what is this? These aren't corporations, this is fakery. So we've got to start talking about that and close it down and fix it up. And I'll tell you something else, the rules are all in place. If we went back and looked at our insurance regulatory rules, all of this business of insurance guarantees of offshore gambling, that wouldn't have happened. But it's all because all of this is done in sort of international interspace where there are no rules and you can cook anything. Now, what really burns me up is this stuff has been going on for 20 years. We have had one collapse after another that said national regulation doesn't work in an international space. BCCI, the world's 5th largest bank, goes down in flames, regulated by nobody. When they check, there's no capital, no money on the books, and they're running a criminal enterprise. Everybody is shocked. That was something right out there for everybody to see. There were scandals after scandals after scandals, and there are too many to name. But I think of long-term capital management. One bunch of, Nobel Prize winners figure that you can leverage
Apparently in
$100 million.
literature, not in economics.
Right, must have been. You can leverage $100 million to $1 billion and make money in perpetuity because they had a computer program. And then what does the world do? We create something called the Financial Stability Forum, which is a fig leaf to cover up the fact there is no stability. I can go back through other beauties, like capitalization. We knew in an investigation I did for the Foreign Relations Committee in 1974 that Citibank was undercapitalized. I sat with Hans Angermüller, the then general counsel of Citibank, and argued. And he said 1% capital is perfectly adequate for our worldwide operations because we can always borrow money from other people to cover our obligations. And I'm saying that's mad. You've got to have some capital. You've got to have something at risk. He obviously won the argument. Then we get these Basel fancy agreements over capital. And the Basel agreements, in effect, agree with Angermüller. Less is more. How did that happen? And why does that happen out of public view? And why doesn't anybody understand the consequences of it? And that's the question I put.
I want to draw the audience into this conversation. I think we can carry on for quite a while, but I suspect a few of you have some questions that you might like to ask the audience. So if you would, go to the microphones here and up there, identify yourself and your affiliation, and let's try not to do the Harvard thing, which is give a speech in the form of a question. And number two, let's limit ourselves to one question. On those terms, let's go ahead. Yes.
My name is Teresa Chewie. I'm just interested in this topic. I studied at the London School of Economics in 1987 and studied all of this and didn't find a job in it because I think you're absolutely right. There is no framework that really understands it. My question is, I'm convinced the Secretary of the Treasury is doing his best under a difficult situation. But I'm really, and I don't support this administration. I worked really hard against it for 8 years. I'm concerned that he keeps changing his mind about the bailout package. And I'm concerned because of the effect on the equity markets. People are losing their retirement funds because of these mistakes.
Joe, I think all three of you might have something to say on this one. The Secretary of the Treasury changing his mind. Anybody want to jump in here?
What he says is, it echoes a statement that Keynes made, you know, when circumstances change, I change.
Right.
The problem is that they fundamentally didn't understand the nature of the problem. They didn't see the problems coming. It was very clear that we were having a real estate bubble back in 2005, that it was very clear the longer it went, the deeper it would fall. And even after, as you mentioned, July 2007, when things began to unravel, they didn't want to admit that there was a fundamental problem, which was a very deep financial sector problem, but also a macroeconomic problem. As recently as April, they were saying, we see light at the end of the tunnel. As one of my friends put it, it was a train coming at us, not it was not the end of the problem. So he fundamentally didn't understand it. Now, they approach it from the point of view of financial markets, where they engage in what might be called confidence games with everybody else, and they thought all we needed to do was increase confidence. And what do you do by increase confidence? Give speeches and say, we have a lot of money to spend if you need it. But it makes a difference in how you spend the money. And he didn't understand that the original proposal, which he has now totally abandoned, was fundamentally flawed in the sense that it would be very difficult to buy these thousands and thousands of assets very quickly. And even if you did and you paid fair market value, it wouldn't have solved one of the underlying problems. One of the underlying problems is the banks have made bad loans. And because they had made bad loans, people weren't repaying, and that created a hole in the balance sheet. And that meant you had to fill in that hole. They had too little capital. And that was an example of basic failures. So it's good that he's recognizing his repeated failures to understand, but it'd be a lot better if he understood it in the first place.
Jack, Rob, yeah.
There's an old saying about, in the military game, they say, well, if you're a hammer, you see nails. So if you're running an army, you see a battle as a solution to your problem. If you come out of Goldman Sachs, you see helping the counterparties of Goldman Sachs as a solution to your problem. Some of us actually come out of other worlds where we see other kinds of solutions to the problem. I happen to come out of a world where I've seen real wages declining. When I was actually starting out, I could count on the fact I had regular pay increases, and that terrifying first mortgage I had looked less and less important over time as I began to get paid more and more money and got a better salary and had a better life. What's happening now is people who start out with the assumption they can afford it now can't carry the payments. Now, there's one other aspect of this I have to talk about, because it isn't just mortgages. I have to mention credit cards, which are one of the most pernicious problems in the American economy. There used to be usury laws. The banks blew them out in the name of free market capitalism. We can't do that anymore. 30% interest is fine. I grew up in North Jersey. The people who charged 30% interest collected with baseball bats and kneecaps. So here are, quote, legitimate banks doing that. Now, what were they doing? Instead of underwriting the loans, they were mailing credit cards to your kid, your dog, to you, to passing them out to college kids, and saying, well, look, we know you're not going to repay, but we'll charge everybody 30%. The really nasty piece is very small monthly payments and very large loan balances. So they could say, nothing's in default, and they're collecting a huge stream of income, and here are all these people not realizing they're never going to be able to repay that credit card debt. So now we really have a huge problem for average people who've been caught in something they didn't really understand and were living because they have declining income, like my niece, for example, who was out of work for a period of time, lives on her credit card, makes up the hole with the credit card, and then can't pay it off. And then what do the banks do? They come in and lobby Congress for a change in the bankruptcy law, so they put these people in a sweatbox. Now, I believe the solution to this problem begins at the bottom, not at the top. We must now, immediately, reform the bankruptcy law. The one way we can recast all of these lousy mortgages is by bankruptcy proceedings. That's the only real way to do it. We ought to change that law right now. We ought to change the credit card law.
Got some other questions.
Over here.
Sorry about that.
My name's Sahan, and I'm an undergraduate. I'm a junior at the college. And I guess my main question is about the political economy of all of this, because it seems whenever there's a problem, everybody talks about the solution. I mean, there's a pretty good understanding of what needs to be done, but only cosmetic changes are established, and then once, you get out of the rut, everything is, the same. I mean, with the IPO bubble, for example, it seemed, people were talking about, establishing, change, having a stronger regulatory framework. There was Sarbanes-Oxley, but then you have the problem now. So my main concern is, it seems everybody understands what needs to be done, or I mean, there's a good understanding of what needs to be done, but to what extent is that going to translate into a framework that's going to last even beyond when we get out of this credit crisis?
I have a simple answer.
Yeah, let Rob
it's
take
you.
this one. Right.
I think that actually is, it is you. But the political economy of it is reflected in our budget. There's an interesting little exercise that you can all do right now. You can put your left hand up like this and just sort of draw a line. This line is the amount of revenue coming into the federal government. This is a percentage of GDP, and this is time. What we can see is that from a few years ago, interest on the debt, Social Security, Medicare, and tax expenditures, a whole host of loopholes ranging from deductibility of mortgage interest to subsidies for private jet aircraft. These four things are steadily rising, and they're absorbing all the revenue of the United States government. In 12 to 15 years, all of this revenue will be completely absorbed. Everything that you think of that the government does will be gone. The Federal Aviation Administration air traffic controller that enables your planes to land safely does not get paid. No money for the Army, Navy, no money for the national parks, no money for any of that. No court system, no immigration control, no national security. Now, the budget of the United States is an architecture of relationships among people. It's a set of promises that we've all made. It's an architecture of trust that has become terrifically out of balance. Because it's unsustainable, it must change. And the imbalance that you talked about in terms of income distribution, that you've often talked about, Joe, is an imbalance of a stretching of these relationships about who gets what, who pays for what, and who owes what to whom. It is now tremendously stretched, as stretched as it's ever historically been. And it must come together. Whenever these relationships are stretched and are resolved, the political pain is great. We've had 4 previous ones in U.S. history. The first one was the imbalance between British and American citizenship. It was resolved by the American Revolution. The second was the imbalance between free and slave American. It too was resolved through conflict. There was an imbalance between women voters and male voters. Women weren't allowed to vote. Male and female citizenship, which took 40 years to work out, and in the end involved the lives of several suffragettes. Finally, that imbalance was resolved. The fourth one was the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Hundreds of people were killed. We are facing now a resolution, a civil transition, like the ones that went before, of enormous size. And in terms of talking about the politics of this, this issue of regulation and supervision is really quite superficial in comparison to the deep economics of the imbalances that exist in the United States and that are reflected quite explicitly in the federal budget, imbalances with respect to region of the country, line of business, income, and generation. We hear about generation all the time, but there are 3 other ways in which it's terrifically out of balance. And it's in the resolution of this process, the civil transition, that these other issues will be dealt with.
Right.
Can I just make
one, and then I want to get to these questions.
In a way, put it in a much more narrow context, which is what happened in the passage of TARP will happen again. In the context of the passage of TARP, financial markets stood at Congress with a gun at their head and said, if you don't give us $700 billion, the financial system will collapse, everybody will suffer, and so you're getting off cheap giving the financial system, the guys who caused the problem, giving them $700 billion, you're getting off cheap, and besides, you'll get paid back, although they didn't offer to pay a tax that would ensure that they would get paid back. That same thing is going to be going on going forward. What they will say will be things, if you have the kind of regulation that some of us have talked about, you will depress the financial system. If you try to restructure TARP to make it more effective, they'll say you will depress the financial system. And the result of that is all the problems you've talked about, wages at the bottom, all those other problems will get worse. So that's where the debate is going to be. They aren't going to say, give us more money. They're going to say, if you don't give us more money for ourselves, everybody in America is sacrificing for everybody else. But what they're going to say is, if you don't give us this additional money, you all are going to suffer. Okay. So this is the cheapest way for you to help yourself.
Pay now or pay later. Yes. Up here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Marco Ziquera. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. My question is, it seems from your earlier comments that transparency is a big issue for regulation, but there's also the issue of regulating specific products and capital requirements and so on, which require actual intervention by the regulator. And for those issues, you need to have really good regulators who are capable and able to do that. And it seems that even in the U.S., which is a very sophisticated market, the regulators has its faults. For example, the SEC implementing the short sale ban, which was it seemed to be quite disastrous. So what's your opinion on what the regulators So how can we improve our regulators to take on that task? Yeah.
I think there you've raised a very serious set of problems. We have a lot of regulatory agencies that have been operating on a check-the-box kind of thing where they go in, is the paperwork all right, without looking at the big picture. So they'll be looking at an institution and they'll be looking at paperwork requirements rather than is the place solvent and is it being properly managed? And there are so many obvious questions to ask. How could you have a regulatory agency that signs off on the books of some of these brokerage firms and says, yep, they got the right amount of capital, and a couple of weeks later they're near bankrupt or bankrupt? So part of it is a matter of talent. People have worked in these agencies for 2-3 years and immediately get hired at salaries 2 or 3 times what they could have made inside the regulatory agency. But I think part of it also is that we've been in an environment where they've been told not to regulate. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which should have been on top of the petroleum market, rather turned around and said, oh, we don't need to look at contracts that involve offshore trading of oil. And the consequence of that, we understand, is oil prices go absolutely beyond anybody's expectation of being realistic. And then we find out that this trading operation is essentially manipulated by a group of Russians in St. Petersburg, by Mark Rich and Glencore out of Switzerland. And the next thing you know is when the air goes out of the bubble, the price of oil comes way down. Now, those markets should have been regulated.
I think the other answer that I'd make as a member of the faculty here is that we come from a generation that treasured and honored public service. And for most of you growing up, the trust in government and the valuation of public service throughout the United States has been much lower. And now you see in part the size of the price that disrespect is going to incur. And for your own generation, I think it's really deeply important to think about why so many of you are here at the Kennedy School and what you can do here in the United States and abroad to not just establish that trust again, but to lead us all into a new and better world.
Can I make one
Yes.
more brief comment, which is recognizing these problems of regulation means you have to be attentive in thinking about the regulatory design. So for instance, there are some regulations that are relatively easy to implement. Relatively, I mean, if you have a regulator who doesn't believe in regulation, he won't regulate. So you have
Chris Cox not
somebody
needing
like
any more
Alan
money,
Greenspan
yeah,
who
right.
didn't believe in regulation. You're not going to get good regulatory behavior. But for instance, some of the things that we've been talking about, restrictions on what kind of incentive pay, the disclosures on stock options, speed limits on the rate of expansion of certain asset categories, the restrictions on not dealing with under-regulated Cayman Islands offshore. Those are relatively easy to implement. And if you had more transparency in the regulatory agencies, one of the advantages of the internet is that you can use many eyes to make sure what is going on.
Yep, let me go up here.
Hi, my name is Audrey Kim. I'm a senior at the college. My question has to do with the earlier comment made about the Basel agreements and the reason why they were kept out of the public eye. It seems that from the comments made tonight and sort of general commentary about the financial crisis, that even if they had been in the public eye, there's great doubt as to whether the public would have understood them. And even with regards to the last question, if the regulators don't even understand what's going on, how can the general voting populace be expected to do so? So my question is whether, is what you expect the source of this sort of misunderstanding of the public of economics broadly and finance in particular, and whether that's sort of permanently out of reach of public understanding?
I don't think it's permanently out of reach. I think that you all in this room have the educational background and the capacity to dig in and look. The question is, do you know where to look and are you pointed in the right direction? And there are some things I'm going to say about this that may upset some people here, but one of the things that's astonished me is the number of economics majors and PhD candidates was way down during this period, while the number of business school students shot right through the roof. People didn't want to really understand what was wrong. They wanted to become the people who proselytized in favor of the new economics. What you all have to do is now go back and relook at some of this stuff, and you'll realize, A, it was understandable if anybody had looked, and B, it was filled with a lot of nonsense.
Over here.
Kelvin Teo, I attend the Graduate School of Design. I would like to ask this panel to perhaps brainstorm for us. Let's assume that there is a global framework that has been agreed upon and will be acted upon, and that each of you have been asked to serve on the board of directors of this regulatory agency. Could you brainstorm for us what sort of measures or indicators would you look at over time to assess the efficacy of regulation?
I'll take that one on, because I think that I was just on NPR this morning talking about a man named Mariner Eccles, who was a genius in the early years of the New Deal, who helped Roosevelt put in place the controls that stood well over the next 40 years in terms of regulating finance, and then went on to become the Federal Reserve's chairman. In fact, the Federal Reserve in Washington is housed in the Eccles building. The lesson of Eccles and the lesson of the New Deal is that what we need is a system of regulation that works across borders, but that more importantly looks at three component parts. One, is there an absence of severe volatility in the financial system, which can be indicated by a number of factors. Two, is the distribution of income and wealth growing more extreme or less extreme over time? And three, is the rate of growth stable over a period of time and generally greater than in periods of high volatility of financial markets? Those would be the three criteria I'd use.
There are other things that you might want to look at. As I said, several of us have said, financial markets are supposed to manage risk and allocate capital, and they're supposed to do it efficiently. If there are large transaction costs, you ought to be suspicious. They shouldn't be having large fees. That's a sign of a failed financial system, unless they can sort of explain what are they doing for those fees. Are they actually contributing to the increase in the productivity? So there are venture capital firms. You could understand what they're doing. They're funneling money into new enterprises. But when you're exploiting people through credit cards, then you ought to be worried.
Over here.
Richard Healy from the Grassroots Policy Project. I work with National People's Action, which is the group that first helped pass the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977 and are now thinking, what should they be demanding, what should they be asking? And I think the thing that they might be most interested in, they represent thousands and thousands of people around the country. A comment was made earlier that the banking system is not an end in itself, but a means to aiding the real economy. And to what extent is that subservience to the real economy automatic if it's well regulated in the terms that you have spoken of it? Or in fact, are there further measures which would be needed to help ensure that the credit system does in fact serve the real economy?
Well, I think if banks are operating properly, they will serve the real economy. In other words, if they're in the lending business, it works. And I'm going to tell you a little story about a visit I had in the 70s with the then president of cashier of Bank of America, a man named Lee Prussia. And he was explaining to me how he had transformed Bank of America. For many years, Bank of America was a community bank. They made mortgage loans in their communities. They had many branches all over the state. They took in savings. They weren't enormously profitable, but the founder, a man named Giannini, believed in serving the community. Well, the new gang took over Bank of America, and Prussia said, that business just isn't very profitable. I know what's profitable. When we make very large loans, and we don't have to do a lot of underwriting, we make a lot of money. Now, I've found a perfect market. It's sovereign debt, because we all know that nations don't renege on their debts. Of course, Prussia was the man who crashed Bank of America and led to its merger with North Carolina National Bank, which moved it from San Francisco to Charlotte. But the point was, when the bank stuck to its business, it really did the job properly. Now, the question here is, when do regulators begin to say, wait a minute, you have a job here to do, and this is why you got your charter? And that, I think, will bring bankers back to the business of being bankers. Right now, they're in the business of being paper processors and product developers, and not lenders.
Rob?
I participated in the work to pass the Community Reinvestment Act. I'm of a sufficient geriatric degree of advancement. I believe that I don't have any particular problem with global finance and the allocation of capital globally, even from a local economy. If it's a very high saving area, it transmit the savings to the rest of the United States. If they go abroad, that's perhaps even better. But I think the key is to link the compensation of executives to the long-term success of the institution. If you allow executives to use other people's money and pay themselves large performance fees so that they can take money out for themselves in the short run, so that they then are not concerned with whether or not the loan gets paid back. If they have skin in the game, and that skin is regularly abraded to remind them that indeed they are part of the game, then I believe in possibly the most important incentive will be satisfied. If the bank grows from good lending, securitization, even complex financial operations, but the executives are held accountable for it, it'll be fine.
I want to ask the three of you something that comes out of this question, which is in the last several weeks, we have seen Goldman Sachs, American Express, and some other rather non-commercial banks become commercial banks. Is this the kind of sticking to your knitting that you're thinking of, Jack?
Not
or
at all.
do you have concerns?
It's
either of you?
unraveling the knitting.
All right.
American Express is no more a bank than I am.
Maybe we should all be banks is the lesson.
I'll get a bank charter and let's go tap that $700 billion.
All right. Let me get up here. I want to get
let's
up
get
here.
some more.
My name is Marlene. I'm a Mason Fellow here at the Kennedy School. I'm interested in the failed philosophy of the economies, just the early lessons learned. And I'd like to hear each panelist's view on this failed philosophy and where economic thought and theory should be going, since it's more market failure instead of the working of markets.
Right. I mentioned earlier that there are 4 examples of previous kind of civil transitions, a situation in which the relationships among citizens in a society became so stretched and unsustainable they had to be resolved. And in the civil transition, the only way it could occur was through disruption. A fourth that has been argued to me is that the Depression itself involved a civil transition. There was a period of overextension, collapse, loss of trust, and something extremely important happened. A question for all of you government experts. You are students of it in one way or another. How many of you can tell me what the marginal tax rate in the United States was in 1932? Okay, you're thinking and thinking.
Order of magnitude.
About 20%. What was it in 1938? Hands? 80%. Somewhere in the 5 years between 1933 and 1937, the American society learned something about shared sacrifice. The American society, during that 5-year period, began to reestablish relationships among Americans and reestablish trust. So we have a similar challenge now. We have an enormously stretched circumstance between the budget advantaged or tax advantaged or circumstance advantaged and those who are not advantaged. That advantage, those differences cannot be sustained. They will be resolved. And the process of doing that is the central challenge of government.
Can I just
Just quickly, and then I'll come back.
I think this is is a dividing moment. In a sense, in many of the developing countries, there had already been suspicion of, you might call, market fundamentalism, neoliberalism. But this is a defining moment where everybody understands that markets are not self-adjusting. We should have understood that after the Great Depression. And
We
what was
did understand it after the Great Depression.
But we forgot it.
Right.
But what happened was this idea that actually my teacher helped propagate, which was the idea called the neoclassical synthesis, which said, okay, we need government to manage the macroeconomy, but once you get the economy to full employment, the economy, the private markets are efficient in the allocation of resources. That idea was never supported by any economic theory. It was an assertion that was sort of the minimum way of recovering much of what you could of the market philosophy. Right. But in fact, as I say, there was no economic theory supporting that perspective. What we've now seen is a massive failure of markets in terms of the allocation of capital, management of risk, and realize that markets can't not only don't solve the problem macro, they don't solve the micro problem, and that you need, in this critical area of allocation of capital, which is one of the most important, particularly in developing countries, you need active government intervention. No government outside of the financing of war has ever misallocated capital resources as badly as our America's financial markets. And so whenever anybody talk about wasting money on a hammer in the Defense Department, look at the waste of money by our financial markets.
Up here.
My name is Andrew. I'm a student here at Kennedy. My question is around what you think was a greater problem. Was it the principal agent issue that you talked about before around some of the finance guys having the wrong incentives? Or was it, or is it actually at the bottom of the pyramid, as you've talked about people actually borrowing more than they can actually afford and the sort of bounded rationality of individuals? Which is bigger?
I think they all contributed, and it contributed also. The other one was the macro problem, a Federal Reserve that didn't understand what a central bank is supposed to do, thinking that focusing its attention on inflation rather than the broader stability of the financial system. So, and regulatory agencies not realizing that there are these problems on the incentive structures at the top and on the ability of individuals at the bottom to make those judgments. So in some sense, it's the interplay of all of those that has made this such a big calamity.
Over here.
Thanks. My name is David Levine. I'm a graduate student at the business school and the law school. After the presidential election, there were about 2,000 students cheering in the streets. I saw a statistic today that something like 70% of the population is optimistic about the new administration. I think that optimism is important. It's also delicate. What can the administration do in the short term? What should be their kind of number one priorities to get a quick win, to kind of build on that optimism so that we can keep moving forward?
There is no quick win. But I'm quite confident, actually, that President-elect Obama understands a great deal of what we're talking about. He understands, I'm quite certain, that the core element to get this society, to get this economy working again effectively, is to restore trust. And that means that the economy has to be focused on the lifetime well-being of every American. It has to be focused long-term. There has to be ample transparency and an enormous respect for truth. This question earlier about the principal agent problem, people who are the principals have to be held accountable for the whole transaction, whether it's in making a product that's sold to children, whether it's making a mortgage, whether it's financing a deal. It is restoring a sense of responsibility of one American for another, and I'm reasonably certain from the way he has talked during the campaign, particularly the speech he gave in Philadelphia at the Liberty Bell, was possibly as important a political speech as has been given since the Gettysburg Address.
My name is Michael Brower. I earned a PhD degree in political economy and government from this school over 4 decades ago, back before it was the Kennedy School. It was then called the Littauer School. I am overwhelmingly positively impressed with the honesty of our panel, far above what I came expecting. Thank you. Leading me Leading me to suggest that maybe it's time for even greater honesty in our public language, and asking you folks to comment on this. Isn't it true that for 3 or 4 decades we have not had a democracy in this country? We have had some kind of a plutocracy of an oligarchy, which has gotten us on a slippery slide halfway to fascism? And secondly, aren't we 3 or 4 decades overdue to create a true world government to replace the shaky, practically useless United Nations?
Well, without endorsing the full sweep of your comment, let me address just
I love
one
having a
part
lawyer
of it.
on the panel. Would you advise us after
Yeah.
you finish?
The idea that I think has to be revived is something that came out of the original idea of Bretton Woods. There was a piece of Bretton Woods that everybody's forgotten about, and it was then called a World Trade Organization. Now, that organization was part of the concept of a world financial architecture that included a form of regulation. And that convention, signed by the United States, would have created a body that had enforcement authority over corporate behavior, in that case, particularly antitrust. It was defeated in the Senate by corporations which lobbied against it. I think it's time to revisit that architecture and to take a look at whether or not we can't recreate some of what was then on the table.
Rob.
Yeah, the answer to this question is really the answer to the second question. This question that what does Barack Obama do quickly to build momentum? And I think he has been and will. I will not be at all surprised if in his inaugural address, it reads very much like Franklin Delano Roosevelt's, which spoke deeply about the seriousness of the problems and that there are no quick fixes, that this is going to take a lot of work and a lot of mutual sacrifice to get us through from where we are to where we need to be.
Joe.
I just want to comment.
That is the honest speech that we've not heard.
That we live in global financial markets, and that's why we need global regulation that has to be comprehensive, because otherwise we get into the kinds of problems that have been described. Unfortunately, some of the global agreements that we have, like the WTO, actually are putting us in a bind. And it was interesting looking at the G20 agreement that came out last Saturday. It was clear that those leaders hadn't read the WTO and the Financial Service Agreement, because at the same time they said we need more regulation, and they said we have to have a standstill in making sure we don't go back from the WTO, which includes the Financial Services Agreement. Well, the Financial Services Agreement says there will be no more regulation. It was basically a deregulation framework. So they hadn't really fully realized that they had signed on into this deregulatory philosophy in much of the WTO. So we're going to have to revisit that. And one of the things that Obama has talked about is that there were lots of things that were done in these trade agreements that no one was really fully aware of. And that, as we come to think about regulation issues in financial markets, that's one of the things that will have to be revisited.
I'm going to go up here, and this is the last question. We're coming up on the close.
I'm John Bell. I was class of 06 in the mid-career program. Would you tell us how we should be thinking about the trade-off or correlation between regulation and GDP growth?
Rob.
Well, one way to think about it, as purely as an example, I think it could be done in many areas. Earlier, we had a questioner from Spain. Spain is interesting in this discussion because Spain is the only country in the world that has a capital adequacy requirement that is countercyclical. That is, as the economy strengthens, banks are required to build up loan loss reserves. And then as the economy weakens, those loan loss reserves are drawn down. We don't have that rule in the United States. In fact, we have a number of rules which actually diminish the capacity of a financial institution to build loan loss reserves while the institution is, while the economy is growing. So I would want to see regulatory frameworks which tend to lean against the euphoria of unsustainable economic trends. And the Spanish one was one that is an example, a very cleverly done one, that if done more universally would be very helpful.
Let me just add one thing. If we look at what's happened in the United States, we had very low regulation, and we are having a very bad downturn. And it will be years before we even catch up to where we would have been, if ever, if we had not. So in my mind, phrasing it as a trade-off isn't the right way of thinking about it. Actually, good regulation will contribute both to stability, also to longer-term economic growth, also to more access to finance. One of the problems, the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, is a program that ensures that there's access to more widespread access to finance. By giving finance to underserved communities, you not only promote equity, you also promote growth. So that comprehensive regulation will actually lead to our incentives for innovation, not the kind of innovation that we've had, but incentives to make our economy more productive, manage risk better, more stability, more growth. So the right design of regulation, including like the Spanish provisions, restricting the offshore centers, will actually lead to a more productive economy.
I'd just add one thing to that, which is, isn't that exactly what happened in the period from, let's say, the 1960s right through into the 1970s, when we had fairly good regulation and solid economic growth, and the two go together. The other thing is transparent markets and well-regulated markets actually attract capital. Instead of scaring everybody off the way the current mess has, if you have a market where you know what you're getting and the books are the books, you tend to have an incentive to invest. So I think that the two go together, and it's not trading one off against the other.
We've come to the end of the evening, and I'm reminded of what Professor John Kenneth Galbraith wrote in The Great Crash about that earlier disaster, that one of the fundamental errors of the American people is to associate great wealth with great intelligence. It seems to me that we're in another one of those times and ought to value intelligence now as we proceed further. I want to thank our three panelists, Joe Stiglitz, Rob Duggar, Jack Blum. And thank all of you for joining us here tonight and for your questions. Thank you. Good night.